Hello and welcome back. Today on our tutorial we're going to be looking at doing a composite of a 3D rendered item into a photographic plate in Photoshop, and all the issues and things you need to keep in mind as you're doing this. So this is my photographic plate that I'm working from right here, and what I have here is an actual render of a 3D modeled, textured, lit, and rendered item here. Now, they can't all be dinosaurs and aliens and spaceships and so on. A lot of work like this is done with really common everyday items like this right here. So this is actually what we're going to use, but any same principles will apply no matter what you're working with. So this is sort of a multi-pass render, and I like to get as many different kinds of passes from the render as I can, at least depending upon what I can use here. And let me show you some of the things here that you might need. So depending upon the program that's doing your rendering, you could get a PSD like this, or you could have each pass as a separate image. It's really all the same. I've just taken and compiled these together. But if I look at these down here, I've got what's commonly called an albedo now in the render, although material color is something that I would have known of this, at least in times past. So you see just the color and nothing else. I'm going to have an ambient occlusion pass right here, and you can see again kind of not much going on, and we see some bits right here where we have ambient occluded shadows. This is one of metalness. I don't think I need this, but you can see how it separates out this area here from the model has a metal texture. This is not, so you could separate out those if you needed to. Here's a shadow render, which I think is really helpful to use, and then you have the full quality one. Now I don't need all of these, and the truth is I might not need any of them other than the full quality render, but it's good to have them there just to see what you might want to use. Now the big thing I'm going to want with this is an alpha channel, and that's easy enough to set. Alpha in some render programs it might say transparency, and you could get it as a mask right here, but very possibly it could end up being a channel. So here is our alpha channel rendered out, showing what the actual model is versus where everything else is not. And often you can depict which items you want to be rendered and included in this alpha channel. So I'm going to command click or control click or PC. So I'm going to load this channel as a selection, turn on all my color layers, come back here, and then on that layer click the mask button down here to mask it off. So that's what you're looking for. And there are many ways you can do selections, make masks in Photoshop, but having an alpha channel rendered out from your 3D program or your renderer is going to give you the best result. So that's what you're going to want to do. Something else you're going to want to know before this is all set up is the size of your plate. And it doesn't matter whether I'm going to print this or use this for display or something. I'm really interested in the pixel values. The resolution doesn't matter at all if you're dealing just with pixels. So notice how I've got a pixel value here. It's 3420 by 2320. That's my plate. And what I want my rendered item to be is that exact same size. That way when it's fit in there, it's perfectly going to match the photographic plate. You can see I've got the same size right here on the render. So I'm going to drag from one open Photoshop document for another. And this is why I don't like tabs in Photoshop. I like separate floating windows. So I'm going to grab the one layer that I want and drag it. I'm going to hold down Shift as I drag it and drop it over here. Now holding down Shift, what that will do is it'll drop it perfectly in the center so that all four corners up here match up. If you don't hold down Shift, then likely it won't be where it needs to be. But when you're aligning things up with a render and compositing, you want that to be exact. So again, holding down Shift will do that, especially since these are both the exact same pixel size. Then it will go right there where it needs to be. All right, so part of what I'm going to do as I talk about this is concentrate on what I think is important, and that's working non-destructively in Photoshop as much as possible. And that's what I like to do if I'm not illustrating, but with working photographically, photo editing, matte paintings, even renders, I'm going to do my best to work as non-destructively as possible and use Photoshop's tools to do that. So my first thing I'm going to do here is I've got this bridge image, and you can see that on the render it actually includes that background, which I don't want. I want to have this all by itself. So I'm going to take this layer right here, and this is going to include the mask. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to convert to a smart object. Okay, there we go. So that is the smart object right there. And notice how there's no mask right in here. The mask has become part of the smart object. And I like doing this because I can then mask this out, do additional masking on this layer, and not destroy my original mask, which is just set to the alpha of the render. So for example, I'm going to have to mask off some of this ground here in front, and I don't like to destroy that original mask or alpha if I don't have to. But of course, being a Photoshop smart object, if I double click on this, it'll open up in a separate window, and you can see there it is, all perfectly done, and it has its mask still there. Okay, so we've got this in place as a smart object, and what I might want to do also is have some control over the shadows. I might need to do some color adjustment here. I'm really going to try and match this into the background photo, and that's what we want to talk about. But as I'm looking at this, I probably don't need much else, but it would be nice to have those shadows as an element that I could maybe darken and adjust those as I want as well. So I'm going to come back here to my render. I'm going to come to my shadow pass right there. And you can see that it is in multiply mode. And depending upon how things are rendered out, if it's in a PSD, it's multi-layers, the program might create you a PSD and give you the correct blending mode. And this is the blending mode you'd want for a shadow layer. So I'm going to take this, and I'm just going to once again hold down Shift and drag it over and drop it across my original here. Now you can see that it covers it all up. And if I were to remove the blending mode, make that normal, you can see it's just a grayscale image. So let me undo that, and we can see there is multiply mode. Now what I want here is to start using the amount of alpha or opacity and transparency in this layer to control everything else. So if I'm going to do that, here's my shadow layer. I'm going to option click or alt click between the two, and look what happens. Now this bottom layer here becomes a clipping mask for this shadow layer and any other layer I put on top. And so what I've got then is I've got my original photo plate underneath completely untouched. And that's what I want. There really is almost no reason to start destroying pixels on this photo layer. All right, so we've got this here. It's all looking good. Now you can see that by this I can darken the shadows if I want. And what I want to do is I want to try and match the shadow with the look in the photo. And of course I can adjust the opacity of this layer as well. And so that's what's kind of cool about doing multiple passes. In this case I don't need that many, but you could have a pass for reflectivity and adjust those reflections. You could have a pass for transparent areas, you could have a pass for glowing areas, ambient occlusion, all sorts of things. In this case I just have the shadow. But once again, I'm going to take this so that I can do stuff with it and work non-destructively. I'm going to take this shadow layer, and I'm also going to take and right click there and convert that to a smart object. And we don't see any difference here at all, but I'll show you what can be really helpful and why I'm going to do this. By the way, at this point I don't need my original render here, this PSD, so I'm just going to take that and close that off. And now I just have this PSD that I'm going to work with. And of course I haven't saved it yet since I've started these changes, and I should save it. So I'll do a good old save as right here, and let's just take this and find some good place to put it here. This is going to be not very exciting, but we'll just come right here into personal, and I've got a work right here, and that'll work just fine. So I'm going to save that, and that way I can always, save it as I'm doing stuff, especially before I do something important. Okay, so we've got the shadow layer as a smart object. That's what it was. So if I double click on this, I'm going to open up the smart object. I double click on the thumbnail. There we go, and the smart object. And here's why I'm going to do this here. I want to get some kind of blue color. This is a sky here, nice and blue sky. And there's always going to be some sort of blue in your shadows. If you were to sample, look at all these colors here, these shadow colors all around. No matter what, you'd find a good degree of blue in there. And so I want to grab a blue from something that doesn't have a whole lot of underlying color underneath. So if I were to come here and sort of grab a blue color from that, well, that's kind of nice. Look at that. So you see sort of a purpley blue, but I kind of like that right there. Anyway, I'm just going to grab some blue color to sort of help me out there with the from the original plate. Okay, and then I will make a brand new layer here, and I've started doing this a little bit. I haven't done it a whole lot, but create a solid color layer that you give even more control. It's kind of cool. But I'll do a new layer here, and I'll fill it with that blue. Okay. Now what I can do is I can change the blending mode here, and maybe I'll change this blending mode to something like lighten. And you can see what lighten has done is it will only cover up the colors that are lighter, and so the white stays white, which is of course what we want. But this sort of gray here, that's not quite working. It doesn't have any color in it. I could go to screen. You can see how that looks really nice. I get this nice sort of blue color all over, but it's also lightening up the shadow values. But if I come down here and I come to say hue, hue's not going to work because there's no hue there, but if I'll do color, there we go. So now what I have, and you can see which blending modes are important and how they can help you. I can see that I've now sort of tinted all of this shadow here, sort of this color from the original plate. So instead of just being black and white, and no shadows really are black and white, there's always some good interesting color in there. Now I've got this sort of tinted, and this is really easy to do because it's a smart object. I'm tinting just this one layer. I'm going to close it, and of course I'm going to say save. And then what that means now is that back in this plate here, this shadow is going to have a little bit of color in it. And I'm multiplying. I really never want to multiply black. I want to have some color, and that gives a more realistic look there. So if I'm thinking, you know what, I don't quite see it enough, I could maybe take down the opacity of this layer, yeah, it's kind of looking good. Again, I'm trying to see if I can match the overall shadow look in my plate. But I could go back into my smart object, take this color here that I have, and maybe even take the saturation up a little bit. See, it's actually pretty gray. If I go up here, it's a lot more blue. And then I fill that. There we go. So now we can actually see that's a good deal of blue right there. Way too blue for a normal shadow, but I'll close it and I'll save it. And because it's being multiplied in this plate over here, it should look a little more blue and be more interesting than just black. All right, so I've got these two layers going here. I've got my rendered layer and I've got a shadow layer on top that I can adjust and fine tune. So that all is looking good there. Now, the big thing to know when you have a 3D render, or really any type of artwork, 2D or 3D, that's completely CG, and you want to combine it with a photo, you need to kind of make that work for you here. And so I'm going to zoom in here and show you what I mean. Any type of photo, digital photos particularly, which is kind of what we all have now, you're going to have some noise and you're going to have some softness. No matter how much in focus your photo is, the normal CG render is going to be probably a bit too sharp. And so in order to make this look photographic and fit in with the photo, this goes for still compositing, working with compositing, video, anything. You need to consider some blur and some noise or grain. That's what we need to do here. And also think about how we're going to do that non-destructively. Now if I click back on my render here and I go to my filters and I go to blur in Photoshop, we've got the Gaussian blur, which hopefully everyone from Photoshop knows. That's all kind of cool stuff. The Gaussian blur is not a great way to simulate a camera lens blur. Now there is a lens blur here, but it's grayed out, so I don't know why this is. I find it really frustrating. This is kind of what you want. This will give you a better approximation of what you get with a camera lens blur. And Even more so if something's out of focus. And this photo here is generally in focus. But for some reason, this particular and only this blur filter will not work with a smart object. What to do? Well, let's try this. I found a better workaround. Now, an easy one is just to use a Gaussian blur. That's simple. However, again, not a very accurate blur. What I found works good for this case is something here in the blur gallery. And this actually, you can see these are selectable. These will work on a smart object. And I'm going to come here to iris blur. So let's click that. And what's going to happen is we get sort of this little program. I'm going to zoom out a bit here on this. We get almost like this sort of little mini app or mini program that pops up sort of on top of Photoshop. It sort of takes control over Photoshop. And this is the iris. And what we have here is we have the amount of blur. Currently it's 15 pixels. And then we have this right here in the middle, which is the origin of it. And so this means this is where there's zero blur, and we come out here, and at this first point, that's where the blur starts. And this last point here is where the blur ends and is full strength, 15 pixels. So imagine this, from here is 0 to 0, and from here is 0 to 15 pixel blur. Now that's way too blurry. You see, as I look here, this is far too blurry for the plate. Now, here's the trick here that you need to understand. You're not trying to make your 3D rendered image look blurry. You're trying to make it match the plate. That's really it right there. And so very often you will need a tiny bit of blur. So this 15 pixel blur is way too much, and I can take and crank that down to something less here. And you can even do it by grabbing this little sort of radial slider here. But very often for something that's in focus, I might want to do, let's try 2 pixels. 2 pixels. And just that tiny bit of blur really is kind of what we're looking for. Now we can see here that this doesn't quite work because right here is 0, and it's not going to start blurring till out here. So I need to take this whole iris and move it, because I probably want at least a little bit of blur here, and then maybe a tiny bit more out here. But I do need to have it be more than 0, and here's my 0. So I'm going to grab here in the center point, and I'm going to drag it here outside of, again, I'm trying to ignore the plate, but just get my render here. And I'm going to take this slider here, which is where the blur starts, and pull it all the way in here, maybe like this. And you can also change the sort of the size and shape of this iris. I could come out here and I could drag it out so it's bigger. I could even, you can move it around. You can change it to be from a circle to some sort of ellipse. If it is an ellipse and not a circle, you could also sort of rotate it. But basically what I'm trying to say is I want to have a tiny bit of blur here, barely, maybe not noticeable, but just enough to match the photo. And I want to maybe have it a little bit blurrier here, just to show that this part's a bit more in focus, and try and match things here. So let me zoom in, and the usual zoom controls will work here within this sort of little mini app that we have, and zoom in a bit more. Here's 200%, and very often that's kind of what you're looking for. You want to get really, really tightly zoomed in, because you want to be able to see individual pixels and see what's happening. So I'm going to come over here, and what I want to do is I want to look at sort of the photographic quality, the edge quality of my photo plate, and I want to kind of compare it here to my render. And so I want to see kind of what's going on here and see if it looks like it's about the same amount of blur. So remember what I've got here, here's 0, and right here it's 0, and now it's starting to get between 0 and 2 pixels. And this right here looks a little bit too, maybe a little bit too sharp right here. See that edge right there compared to this edge right here? That's kind of what I want to match. So maybe I'll just take this center, which is 0, and kind of pull it out a bit more, and kind of drag this in a bit more like that. That way there's a hint more blur happening here. And again, remember the full amount of the blur is going to happen right here at this edge. So I'm going to come over here and kind of stretch that and scale that out, because I want maybe the full amount of blur to only happen kind of right near the end. And again, we're still talking about 2 pixels of blur, which is not much at all. Let me zoom in here a little bit more and look at this edge. And now that edge looks a little bit softer. I think that looks a little bit better right there. Just that tiny, tiny bit. Again, I'm not trying to make it look blurry, but I want to make it match photographic plate. And so as I come down here and look at this a bit more right down here, I can see the amount of blur sort of near the end of this bridge, okay? And looking at the amount of blur there on the photo. And this actually is looking a little bit too blurry, right? So maybe this 2 pixel blur is perhaps a bit too much. But this program, or this blur actually won't let me do anything. Well, oh, look at that, 1.5. Now, I haven't been able to get that by just kind of grabbing the slider, but if I type this in, I was looking for something that would get it between 1 and 2 pixels. So maybe that 1.5 is actually good. So that's pretty cool there. And if you're kind of thinking it still looks a little bit too blurry, I could grab this in and kind of stretch it out. Remember what that means is that it's not really 1.5 pixel blur until here. So right here it's a little bit less, a little bit less, a little bit less, and then right here it is 0. Now if I like that, I think that looks good, I'm going to say OK. And it takes a while to crunch through, but there it is. And you can see that there we have the blur gallery in my smart filters. So I'm going to save this. But the nice thing about this is, of course, it's a non-destructive filter. So I can turn it off, I could double click on it and go back in and fine tune it. Whenever I filter something, I want to try and find ways to do it non-destructively. And I can look at this and I could turn it off and kind of see the difference here with this and see if I like what's going on there. Again, this is just a tiny, tiny bit of difference, but I find that in any sort of CG element, you really need to add even just a tiny, tiny bit of blur, and that will help it out there. Now here's what's important. Here's also why I wanted to make this a smart object, but not have the mask be part of this layer, but be inside the smart object. Imagine you put a blur gallery and you put it on this this image here. It's going to blur its pixels. Let me kind of come back here to this side here. It's going to blur these pixels, but it wouldn't blur the pixels of the mask. So while it might start looking a little bit softer and blurrier here, the mask would be nice and crisp. You'd have to put a blur on the mask separately. Now you can go in the mask and you can feather it, but it's not the same as what we're doing here. So that's why before we do anything like this, I make this a smart object and include the mask in that smart object, so that any type of blur I'm adding here is also going to affect the edge, which is defined by the mask as well. Hopefully that makes sense. There. And now of course I could put another mask on this right there, and this mask I would need to paint on to sort of put it behind the grass here and maybe kind of behind some of those trees and do things like that. So that's what we have there, and I will certainly be doing that. Now the next thing I talked about is to have some noise. You can see here there's noise in the photo, and the darker the areas get, the more you can see the noise. If you render something out from CG, it's going to have no noise or no grain. I mean, it used to be film grain we dealt with, but since there's no film anymore, it's all digital, there still is noise. And that's what I need to do to try and make this CG element look like it's part of the photo. That's a really, really important part there. So I could take and apply, there are various ways you can apply noise and grain in Photoshop. I do like to use noise right here, the add noise. That's a really handy thing to do. But what you'll notice by doing this is that when you add noise, let's cancel that, that's a mistake. I'm on the mask. I need to click on the actual layer. There we go. So if I do here and I do a noise and I do add noise, you can see it adds noise to it, but this noise is too rough and crunchy. And it's not quite going to work. It needs to be a bit softer. And I could do a blur, but then that blurs not only the noise, it will also blur these pixels here, and that's not what I want. What I'm going to do is cancel this, is I'm going to do this all on a separate layer. And that way my noise is completely separate, and I can do all kinds of crazy things to it and not affect my render. Let me show you what I mean by that. I want to add a new layer here. what I want to do before I click the new layer button, and you do the same thing by going up to layer and new right here. But if I hold down the option or alt button when I click the new layer button here, it gives me some options here. Not only can I name the layer, but I could use the previous layer to create a clipping mask. That's what I want to do anyway. But here's the cool part about this. I can change the blending mode of the layer. And I can make various blending modes and you know, try, for example, and say overlay. Now, here's the important part here that you need to understand. This is cool right here. It says fill with overlay neutral color, 50% gray. You should know that with all of your darkening blending modes, white will be transparent. For some reason, Photoshop calls it neutral. With all of your darkening, there's your darkening, with all your brightening blending modes, black will be transparent, and with all your overlay blending modes, 50% gray would be transparent. Now, why is that important? And I'll show you for our purposes here. If I just make a brand new layer, there's my empty layer to add noise, and I go here to filter, and I go to noise, and I try to add noise, Photoshop's going to say it couldn't do it because it's empty. What that means is that Photoshop can't put noise on empty pixels. It's got to have pixels there already existing. It can't put it on transparency. Well, that's kind of a bummer, so let me delete this layer. All right, so if I hold down Option once again, Alt or Option, click the brand new layer button, and I'm going to choose overlay, because I don't want this noise to just darken the render, and I don't want it to just brighten the render. I want it to be kind of a mix of both, and that's overlay. So if I fill with an overlay neutral color, 50% gray, I'm going to say okay. There's the layer. Hopefully you can see it's got a fill on it. It's filled to 50% gray. Those are pixels there even though you can't see them because of the blending mode. And because they're there, Photoshop can apply noise to it, which is cool. But before I do that, I'm also on this layer going to right click and I'm going to convert to a smart object. So I'll show you why. So now even though I can't see the pixels, I can go to filter, I can go to noise, and I can do add noise. And look, there it is. I can see those right there. Now notice we have a monochromatic option. If I turn that off, I get some color. And basically what you want to do, just like the blur, you're not trying to make this look noisy or grainy, you're just trying to match the photo. And as I look and try and figure out the noise on my photo plate, it looks to me like this noise is monochromatic. And if there were a color, I could uncheck this and get a little bits of color in there. So I'm going to keep it to monochromatic. That looks right. And you've got two types of noise basically in this filter. We have Gaussian noise and we have uniform. Notice how the Gaussian, no matter what the amount is a bit noisier, has more contrast. So I'm going to try this uniform. See that right there? I can see this load of noise, 4.8. Generally you don't want a huge number. We'll say okay. Now here's why it's awesome that this is a smart object, because this add noise filter is also non-destructive. Now of course it's a bit too crunchy. I don't really see the noise like that. So if you're going this route, the best way then is once you've done noise to go back to your filter, and now we can use our favorite Gaussian blur, and we're just going to soften the noise a little bit. And I'm trying to match what I see here. Very often you're going to want something with a radius of less than 1 pixel. So there I am kind of softening that noise, right, like that. 0.9, that's okay. And there we go. And so the cool thing about this is that even these filters right here, they are non-destructive on my noise layer. And I could even double click here and we could just call this noise, just so I know. Now if I'm going, you know, I see a little bit too much noise there, it looks a little bit too much. This is why having a smart filter is great. I'll just double click on the add noise filter. It's at 4.8. Maybe I'll take that down just a little hint there, 2.45. It gives you weird little increments. But I can say okay. And now I've got that noise, but perhaps that's not quite enough. But you see how you can kind of fine tune that with smart filters. So I'm going to undo that, undo the edit filter. So see how it's a bit too noisy? But now I'll just take that layer's opacity down. And just take it down to where I feel like it's kind of matching here. And so maybe 60%. There we go. And so now what I've done here is I have taken this image and this and I've put the 3D rendered object in there. I've used non-destructive methods to do this, and added some blur and some noise to make it match the plate better. So let's save it. Now the cool thing about this is that if something were to change, and this happens all the time, clients change their mind, or maybe they decide they want the view bigger, maybe the color's different, maybe it's different size, and you re-render, all you have to do is just double click on the smart object, come in here, and then put in your new rendered item. Come here to the shadow, double click on that and put in the new rendered item, and there you go. So what I can do here with this is kind of fine tune some things a little bit. With my render, I could do a curves adjustment right here, and overall it's looking pretty good, I would say. But I could fine tune values if I wanted here with my curves. I could say, let's look right here at this top area, click on that, maybe kind of move that up and brighten that a little bit right there. Okay, that could look good. And maybe also I could do a little color adjustment. If I come to my red channel and I click here, I can make this look a little bit redder and match things up there. So all that's looking looking pretty good with that. So there's my my curves adjustment for things. And of course, being on this layer right here, adjustment layer, if I had a mask there, I could do a gradient on that and just kind of adjust the amount and kind of have that fade away and do some things there, kind of fine tune that gradient mask for the adjustment layer. And again, properties, you can kind of fine tune the density of that mask. So let's look at all the various options you have. I'm using Photoshop's tools to really help me out and do a lot of very cool, precise work, but again, non-destructively. So what I really want to focus on here and stress is work non-destructively as much as possible. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a few things here. Now I've got to maybe do some other work and attach this here, but the main thing I know is that this part of this bridge has to go underneath this area of this little hill with the grass. So if I turn off this layer, I can see that right there. Now I want to kind of mask some of that off. That's what I want to do right along there. And so if we look at this edge, it's a really complex edge, little grass tufts and all that. So I want to get all that detail in there if I can. The best way to do that is to make a mask procedurally. And I've done this with other videos. I'll just kind of really quickly go through it here. I'm going to come to my channels and look and see which channel has the most contrast between what I want to keep, and that's this area here, and what I want to get rid of, and that's the grass. There's the red, there's the green, and there's the blue. So it looks to me like it's probably going to be, I would say the red, right? So I'm going to take that channel, I'm going to duplicate that channel right here. Great. And I want to kind of imagine the mask that I can make. So I want, this is dark here, it needs to be, dark and then white right here. So really quickly, I'm going to do a levels adjustment, grab my black adjustment here, and kind of move that in. Okay, it looks good. And I'll do my white adjustment. You can see what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to kind of bring all this stuff here together. Ooh, there we go. So that's the kind of edge I'm looking for. I want to make sure that this black slider and this white slider don't get too close together, because I want to have some grays to anti-alias the edges. But that's kind of what I'm looking for right there, that sort of edge right there. Okay, great. Now with this happening, I really just need this part right here, so I'm going to again load this alpha channel. Again, any channel you have after your color channels is an alpha channel, no matter what it's called. So I'm going to command click or control click on the PC, load that as a selection, turn on my color layers, come back here, turn this layer on, and click on its mask now. And zoom in a bit so I can see what I'm doing. I'm going to make sure that I have my default colors, pure black and pure white, and switch those so that black is my foreground color. And I'm not making a mask of this whole thing. I just want to just sort of paint in a little bit here of this mask. So I'm going to get a brush, come right about here, and then with that selection active, since this was white, I can just kind of paint in there and look, sort of paint that out. Right along there, and kind of right along in there. There we go. There's no better way to get a complex, good mask edge than like that. Working from the channels and making that mask procedurally. Okay, now I can deselect and just kind of, I want to get all the stuff covered right here. Right, there we go, we have that. And then along here as well, kind of get all that happening. Just kind of painting here because I want this to be solid black all along in here. And sometimes I like to look at the mask, and you can do that by Alt or Option clicking right on it, and then you can kind of see what's happening. Oh, okay, I need to kind of fill that in there. See how helpful it can be to actually look at the mask while you're working on it in some cases. Yeah, there we go. See, let's make sure we kind of clear up all those little white gaps right in there. All right, so that's what you get if you Alt or Option click on that mask. Great, I can do that again, Alt or Option click to get back here as well. Now, sometimes what might happen if you make a mask this way, these edges can be a little bit too sharp. So look along there, yeah, those edges are a little bit too sharp. I mean, the softness here is working, it looks good with the photo, but again, those edges of the mask kind of look a little bit too sharp, especially sort of right there. Well, that's why we have this great option here with the properties. Just take this and feather the mask a little bit. And look, 0.6 pixels, and just soften that a little bit so it looks a little more like the photo. You want your edges, everything, no matter if it's a mask or the edge of your CG render, you want that to look like the photo. And the cool thing about this is that by feathering the mask, I can soften or sort of blur those edges, but again, non-destructively, so that if it's too much or too little, I can come back and change it. Non-destructive tools. Photoshop has a lot of them, and it's really great to try and implement them in your workflow, and as much as you can. So this is actually looking, pretty good right here. This is a good way of combining this, especially as I sort of zoom in and check things out. See how that looks. Here's my shadow layer. See how it has that nice bit of blue happening on it, right? Because I tinted that shadow layer as a smart object. I think I might want it to be just a little bit darker, so maybe like 50-60%. But this is a great point of having a multi-pass render, so that I can sort of fine-tune that a bit, fine-tune, adjust that on a separate layer. That's why you like the multi-pass stuff. And so if I come down here, maybe it's looking a little bit too dark down here, but not too dark here. So again, on that shadow layer, I could add a mask right there, grab a gradient, and then just kind of at this farther end where I want to take it down a little bit, just put a gradient kind of right there. And now look, I've lessened the shadows there. Now it's a bit too much, but the cool thing is, again, by working with the properties of a mask, I can lower the density and bring back some of that. Just kind of fine tune that right there. Now, the real trick here is to integrate the CG render into the photograph as much as possible. And as I look here, I've got all these trees. Let me turn this layer off. Yeah, I've got some of these trees right here that, or bushes, whatever, that kind of looks like that it would sort of go behind those. Well, the cool thing about that is I'm going to click on the mask for my 3D render, get my brush, make sure I'm painting with black, and I'll size the brush down a little bit here, and then I can just kind of paint here and sort of paint it out where it might be hidden by these these bushes here. And I can't quite see what I wanted to do, so I could paint out a whole bunch kind of like that, maybe. And maybe even up to sort of like here. Okay, there we go. All right, that's cool. And then I'll swap back to white, and then on the mask, kind of paint the bridge back in. Right there. And this doesn't have to be too exact. I'm just kind of doing some just some little rough things here, just to kind of scribble and sort of suggest what might be going on, right here. I just want to have like little random sort of natural looking edges, and you can kind of get that best just by sort of randomly kind of dabbing and scribbling, just a little bit here as I'm trying to get the you just fine tune where the bridge should be and how it should kind of fit in there. But again, the cool thing is that because this is a mask, I can get rid of it, I can paint it back, I could put some of it back in, just kind of go back and forth until it's doing what I want and looks good there. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. I'll save that. Now this isn't fully completely done yet. I probably need to do some work here to paint a few things out of this background. I've got to add some other things in here. And if I do any painting or cloning to get rid of the background, you can bet what I'm going to do is not paint on my plate, but I'm going to click and make a brand new layer. And I might even just call that paint fix right there. And then when I get my my clone stamp tool for any painting, I want to make sure that for sampling it doesn't say current layer, because there's nothing on the current layer, that it says current and below. Not all layers, because I've got other stuff up here I don't want it to see. I want to see current and below, and that's usually the most useful option for cloning. That way it'll just see what's on this layer, which is nothing, but more importantly, the layer below. And that's about it. This will take a bit more happening to, I think, get it fully there. But we've covered all the important parts that have to do with compositing the 3D element into a photographic plate and how to make it look the most realistic and match the plate. This was helpful, I'm hoping. So leave any comments or have any questions, you can put those in there. And I hope to have more tutorials for you shortly in the future.